LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty, and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and first up today, I'd like to reply to listeners who've said that they'd like to donate to the show, but they do not wish to use PayPal. I have PayPal on the website simply because it's easy, convenient, and pretty much universal, although obviously I appreciate that some people have issues with it. So, if you'd like to donate by means other than PayPal, go to the About page at LegalizeFreedom.com, and there you'll find email contact details. Drop me a line and I'm sure we can come to some other arrangement. I'm happy to accept cheques drawn on UK banks and of course well-concealed cash. Only about 1 in 10,000 listeners currently puts a tip in the jar, so any increase in that number would be most sincerely welcome. Moving on, my guest today is Dave McGowan, who joins us to discuss his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops and the Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream. In the 1960s and early 1970s, California's Laurel Canyon was a magical place where a dizzying array of musicians congregated to create the soundtrack to those turbulent times. Members of bands such as the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, the Monkees, the Beach Boys, the Eagles, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, Steppenwolf, Captain Beefheart, Alice Cooper and the Doors, along with singer-songwriters such as Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, Carole King and Jackson Browne, lived, loved and jammed together in a seemingly idyllic community nestled in the Hollywood Hills. But there was a dark side to this pastoral scene. Many didn't make it out alive, and many of those deaths remain shrouded in mystery to this very day. Far more integrated into the scene than most would care to admit was convicted murderer and cult leader Charles Manson, along with his depraved entourage. Also floating about the periphery were various political operatives, up-and-coming politicians, and intelligence personnel, the same sort of people who just happened to give birth to many of the rock stars populating the canyon. And all of the canyon's colourful characters, rock stars, hippies, politicians, and murderers happily coexisted alongside a covert, some would say sinister, military installation. Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon is the very strange, but nevertheless true story of the dark underbelly of a hippie utopia. Hello and welcome, Dave, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I haven't really had too many opportunities to speak to a UK audience, despite the fact that the book was actually published there. But of course, I'm in the US, and most of the radio stuff I've done has been here. So I greatly appreciate a chance to reach a different audience.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Now, the book you refer to is your book, of course, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. Subtitle is Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and the Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream. Before we jump into that, tell listeners a bit about your background, how you became interested in this particular area, and of course, you're going to be a music fan, otherwise you wouldn't have written this book. So just how, what your journey into music in the first place was.
Yeah, I am a lifelong music fan. I was alive during the period that's, chronicled in the book, which is basically from, say, the mid-'60s to the mid-'70s, which was really the peak of the Laurel Canyon scene, the peak years. And, but I was very young at the time. I was born in 1960, so I was just a lad when all this stuff, went down. But, I was alive and well and living literally like 20 miles from where this all happened. But, unfortunately I was much too young to be aware of or involved in the scene. But, I kind of came of age in the in the 70s, so to speak, but I was very much in tune with the music of that earlier era, and I always kind of felt like I was a kind of a hippie that had the misfortune of being born a decade too late, because, you know, had I been born earlier and reached my teen years during that period, I absolutely would have been a part of that scene, and you know, felt very much that you know, was hugely influential. The music of that era, you know, it really provided the soundtrack to my formative years, so to speak. So I've always been a big fan of that music in that whole era, and the scene that produced that music. And but you know, most of my reading and writing is on much darker quote unquote conspiratorial type topics, and this one I really kind of fell into by accident, as is explained in the preface to the book. I was on vacation, and really kind of wanted to escape from all the insanity, you know, that occupies my day-to-day life, and I kind of viewed this as an opportunity to sort of just tune out all of the madness, and just, you know, have a nice, enjoyable vacation read that would conjure up all of these fond memories of my childhood and all these great songs that helped shape that childhood and adolescence. And instead, as I was, you know, reading through this book, which was Michael Walker's Laurel Canyon, which was a very mainstream treatment of the scene, all these alarm bells kept going off. You know, it was there was just all these, you know, these signals going off left and right, telling me that there was, you know, far more to the story than what was being told in the book. And so I ended up just diving headlong into that whole scene, and just devouring everything that I could find that had been written about it in books and magazines and web posts and newspaper articles, and just everything I could get my hands on, and slowly, bit by bit, pieced together sort of a alternative version that's quite at odds with the mainstream version of you know, how that scene played out and how it came to be, and you know, what kind of influence it wielded and whatnot.
The time period you mention, if people are thinking about anything at all, they'll be thinking Summer of Love, Flowers in Their Hair, anti-war protests, all the rest of it, and they're probably thinking San Francisco. But Laurel Canyon is in California, and what we're really talking about here is in and around LA. So set the scene for us, basically, however you care to, in terms of geography or the background, you know, where these people came from. Because, of course, we're not talking about that many LA natives here. So just for people who aren't familiar, just forget San Francisco. Let's head to LA and just set it out for us.
Yeah, that's one of the things that first fascinated me about this story, is that even the mainstream version is not that well known. And as you say, anytime conversation turns to the 60s and, you know, hippies and flower children and that whole, you know, countercultural movement that was going on, you know, and it was a very eventful decade, to say the least. You know, you had the whole hippie movement and the flower children and all this music. You had the Black Panther movement and women's rights movement and the anti-war movement, and just all kinds of people pushing for social change in various ways. And you had the inner cities exploding in riots, you know, in Watts and Detroit and whatnot. And you had very beloved leaders being picked off left and right. You know, the Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And, it was just, you know, it was just a very, just a decade that was just, really unlike any other. And, the first decade of my existence. And, so very fascinating to me. But, anytime the discussion comes up of that, you know, 99% of the people, their minds are immediately going to Haight-Ashbury up in San Francisco, which is largely viewed as the birthplace and really the, sort of the cultural center of that whole hippie movement. And, interestingly enough, the reality is that it actually began right down here in LA. a couple of years before the parallel scene up in San Francisco, and the scene down here produced far more of the music and far more, influential, spokespersons, so to speak, for that youth generation than did San Francisco. And it was here that the what became known as the hippies really first began, as far as the hairstyles and the clothing styles and the attitude, and that whole look and feel that would eventually become known as hippies. All actually started in L.A. and yet strangely enough, very, very few people, even native Angelenos, are aware of that. And it all happened in one little isolated canyon in the Hollywood Hills, which is a a small mountain range that separates the west side of LA from the San Fernando Valley. And there's a number of canyons that snake through there that provide access, from the city into the valley. And Laurel Canyon was one of those, and very kind of an isolated, very isolated geographically. There's kind of really only one main road going through there, so kind of only one way in and out. And it has a completely different look and feel than the rest of LA, which is, mostly concrete, asphalt, and glass. Whereas Laurel Canyon is very heavily wooded and it's got a very rustic kind of a country feel to it. And so it's this very kind of unique and socially and geographically isolated neighborhood in LA that for about a 10-year period there, from the mid-'60s to the mid-'70s, just became the locus of the whole music and countercultural movement, and just produced a staggering number of bands and singer-songwriters that poured out of there in a very short amount of time. Everyone from I always leave out like half of them because there's so many, but you had the Doors, you had Arthur Lee and Love, the Mommas and the Poppas, the Turtles, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, John Kay and Steppenwolf. Later on, you had Crosby, Stills and Nash, the Eagles. You had a whole bunch of singer-songwriters: James Taylor, Carole King, Judy Sill, Judy Collins, Joni Mitchell, just Randy Newman, and just an amazing array of musical talent, people that were destined to become these superstars, many of whom are still these larger than life icons to this day, people like Jim Morrison and various others, Frank Zappa and David Crosby and Stephen Stills, and just on and on and on. Just this amazing array of talent that sort of spontaneously gathered there and produced this just massive body of musical work, and really kind of emerged as sort of the spokesman and the leaders of that whole hippie, the whole 60s youth countercultural movement.
As you say, you mentioned a few of the names there. I mentioned a few others in my introduction. There's no way we can begin to explore all these individual stories, but we will get to some of the more interesting characters later on. For now, maybe a place to start for me, the first thing that piqued my interest and kind of like, what's going on here, is the family backgrounds of so many of these people. I mean, one of the whole points about your book is drawing together strands of coincidence and saying, look, there's something going on here, or if there isn't, there probably should be, because statistically, what are the odds? So tell folks a little bit about what you turned up when you started looking into the backgrounds, family backgrounds of a lot of these people.
To an amazing degree, so many of these people, particularly the ones who emerged as sort of the frontmen for the band, or as the biggest stars that came out of the bands, seem to come to an overwhelming degree from families that are either career military or military intelligence. just it's really mind-boggling, really, how many of them, beginning with Jim Morrison, who was the son of a Navy admiral, a very high-ranking Navy admiral, and not just any Navy admiral, but the one who was very much a key figure in what became known as the Tonkin Gulf incident, which was when U.S. warships patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin supposedly came under fire from North Vietnamese troops, and which really provided the catalyst for the massive escalation of the Vietnam War, and led immediately to the passing of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution and the introduction of ground troops into that quagmire, which then ultimately resulted in the deaths of some 60,000 Americans and untold millions of Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians, and just laid waste to to that entire part of the world, pretty much. And the Tonkin Gulf incident and the Tonkin Gulf Resolution were the key points that really got that conflict going. And Jim Morrison's father was the commander of the ships involved in that incident, and therefore was very much a key participant in sort of choreographing that whole incident that led to this massive escalation of the war. And that happened like virtually simultaneously with his son emerging out of Laurel Canyon onto Sunset Strip as this sort of larger than life icon of the anti-war crowd. So you had this very curious, juxtaposition here of the father being one of the main people involved in really getting the ball rolling on the war, at the same time that the son is emerging on the scene as the as one of the icons of the anti-war generation. And that pattern just follows, right down the line. Frank Zappa's, father was a chemical warfare engineer, originally working out of the Edgewood Arsenal, the infamous Edgewood Arsenal. And as we know, there was a considerable amount of chemical warfare going on in Vietnam, although it was not labeled as such. But we just dumped untold tons of napalm and Agent Orange and white phosphorus and every other kind of thing on those poor people. And here was another icon of the anti-war crowd whose father was very likely instrumental in coming up with all those weapon systems and just right on down the line, John Phillips, same kind of background. His father was a career Marine Corps officer, and not only that, but his mother, his sister, and his first wife were all career employees of the Defense Department. So, everyone in his family, pretty much, he was just surrounded by military and intelligence personnel. And, David Crosby, his father as well, Stephen Stills. As you go through the list, it's very hard to find someone who emerged as one of the biggest stars of that scene, that the names that endure to this day, who did not come from that family background. It's amazing, really. The deeper you get into it, Jackson Browne was born on a military base in post Germany. All three guys from the Band America were Air Force brats, and first met and got together on an Air Force base where all of their officer fathers were stationed, and just on and on and on. It's remarkable, really, how many of them fit that pattern. And if it's just a few here and there, you can write it off as a coincidence, or as a lot of people tend to want to do. They kind of view it as sort of a natural reaction from these people in terms of rebelling against, I've had a lot of people say, well, doesn't that make perfect sense that these would be the first people to rebel against their, the values of their parents? And there is some merit to that, but when you look down the list and see just how many of them there are that fit that pattern and how few fall outside the pattern, at some point it becomes a little bit much for me to just write off it as coincidence or natural rebellion by these kids. And because we're talking about a time, in the late, mid to late 60s, where every kid in the country wanted to pick up a guitar and grow out his hair and front a rock band. It was just in the spirit of the times. And of course, not everyone has the talent to do that, but a certain percentage of people do. And the question then becomes, were these all these military brats, are they the only ones who had the talent to make it, or were they just the ones who the industry chose to, sign and promote into superstardom? And to me, it's got to be the latter, because it's just very hard for me to believe that, that it was only the kids from that background who just happened to, have the musical chops to make it to that level of stardom.
And also, speaking as an ex-musician myself, and also I've got ears, as you pointed out, a lot of these guys weren't that good. You look at someone like Frank Zappa is phenomenally good, but a lot of these guys were like really sloppy. And we'll come on to a bit more about that later, but it's not at all obvious that these are the people that should have been selected if you were a, record company chief.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the bands had a very sort of contrived look, nature, more like they were cast than just sort of, a bunch of guys who shared a musical vision that came together to form a band. The first band out of the gate, the Byrds, was, possibly the most obvious, where two of the guys had literally never played their instruments before. The Chris Hillman, who was hired as the bass player, was a bluegrass mandolin player, and the guy hired to play drums, what was his name? Clark, Michael Clark. He'd never played the drums in his life. I think he'd played the bongo drums, but never actually held a set of drumsticks in his hand. And yet these were the guys who were, selected to provide the entire rhythm section of what was the very first folk rock band, the band that really set off this whole folk rock revolution and pioneered the sound of, electrifying the songs of people like Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger and whatnot. And, it's just, it hardly seems like a grassroots sort of a coming together of people who shared a musical vision. The way you normally picture a band coming together, it wasn't really like that at all. It was, you had one guy in the band who was actually a skilled musician, which was Roger McGowan, the lead guitarist. And then the entire rhythm section had never played their instruments before. And Gene Clark and David Crosby were, could barely play the guitar. They're so consequently, all of their parts other than McGowan's in the studio were played by studio musicians, just like the Monkees did it, So, yeah, in a lot of ways, these bands were very Milli Vanilli-ish, they were chosen for their look more so than, and some of them did, ultimately develop musical ability over the years, but initially, at least, these were people who were kind of being cast, which again raises the question of, why these particular people? There were talented musicians to be had, but instead they decided to go with people who literally had never picked up their instruments before. So, Yeah, you add that to the interesting family background that a lot of these people had, and it really raises the question of, why them? Why were they chosen to become these huge international stars?
We mentioned earlier about most of these people, if not all of them, not being LA natives, yet they all descend on LA, which was not a music scene hub in the US at that point. And not only do they descend on LA, but it's not even downtown LA. It's this, as you say, leafy suburb. What it all reminded me of, and you talk about this in the book, how they all seem to come from all these different places. It was almost like, and this is just my own silly imagination running away, but it was almost like a load of sleepers that had been activated with a code word or something. Now it was the time to go to LA. Someone in the book says, we went over there like lemmings.
Yeah, Neil Young was quoted as saying, he said we didn't know why we were going. We just all went like lemmings. I mean, he literally said that they didn't, we were just, the Pied Piper was calling. It was very odd because LA was not known as a main hub of music it is now. And that's largely because of Laurel Canyon. That's one thing that people don't really understand. I mean, to people now looking back, they say, well, why not come to LA? This is where you come to be a star in the music field. But that wasn't really the case in those days. There were three main hubs. Detroit was kind of the hub of the Motown sound, and Nashville was the country music hub, and New York was actually the hub of popular music, and LA was just sort of an also ran, and so there was no real compelling reason for these people to gather in LA at that time, and gather so quickly. Just literally within like a year or two, there was just dozens of acts spilling out of Laurel Canyon, and and again, there was no particular reason for that for them to come to LA at all, and certainly not to all congregate in this one little sort of semi-remote, rustic canyon perched above LA. No real compelling reason at all for that to happen, and yet it did. And they all arrived nearly simultaneously, and all playing, very similar types of music. It was quite extraordinary, really, the way with the speed with which it came together, and the fact that all of these people just came from literally all over the country, and in some cases from around the world. Quite a few came from Canada. A couple of people from Steppenwolf came all the way from Germany, and all arriving in LA virtually simultaneously within like I say, within like a couple year period. They all just converged there, and very quickly formed bands, and very quickly were given contracts and provided with instruments and recording space, studio space, and just with remarkable speed this all came together. And all of these clubs started popping up like mushrooms all along Sunset Boulevard. So, as quickly as these bands were forming, they suddenly had all these venues to play at, and it was just remarkable, just how quickly and well coordinated this whole effort seems to have been.
Another interesting wrinkle for me is that in the Laurel Canyon facility was the Lookout Mountain Laboratory, this bizarre military installation. That was just one of those moments. It was like, what? Taken against the background of everything we've been talking about.
Yeah, that was just beyond bizarre. The fact that, right there nestled in the middle of this, the world's first and largest hippie commune was a very, very highly classified, top secret, Air Force intelligence installation known as Lookout Mountain Laboratories that was, in operation at least through 1969 officially, and by some accounts well beyond that. And so you had this fully functioning covert Air Force facility right there in the middle of all of this, budding hippie / flower children scene, which again doesn't quite seem to fit, and And, again, it raises a question, why did all these people come not just to LA, but to this one specific neighborhood that just happened to be home to this top secret military installation, and all of these people coming from a largely military intelligence background just to this, this certain neighborhood in Los Angeles that happens to house a military installation. And then on top of that, you had various other military and political and up-and-coming political figures bopping around in Laurel Canyon. You had both the future governor and lieutenant governor of the state, Jerry Brown and Mike Curb, which Jerry Brown is still our governor to this day as we speak, which is just amazing. But anyways, you had Jerry Brown and Mike Curb. You had one of the guiding lights of the Rand Corporation, who had a home in Laurel Canyon at the time, where he was grooming all of these followers who would later become what became known as the neocon cabal, the Project for New American Century group. They were there camping out in Laurel Canyon. You had this male prostitution ring, which when it was busted, some of the operatives there claimed that their clientele included very high-ranking government and law enforcement figures, including J. Edgar Hoover. So it was a very curious mix of people, to say the least. You have this, as I said before, this sort of geographically isolated and very, fairly small neighborhood that had this strange mix of musicians, many of whom came from a military or military intelligence background, commingling around this Air Force installation, and with all of these up-and-coming political figure or already established political figures, all grouped together in this one small location that just happened to become the birthplace of the hippie and flower child movements. So, I mean, that's a whole lot to write off as coincidence, to my mind anyway.
Yeah, and of course, this was around a time when music was starting to get political, and a lot of people will associate a lot of the artists that we're talking about here, and other figures as well, as you mentioned, as being synonymous with the anti-war movement. Of course, Vietnam going on around this time, and that was very unpopular with a lot of people. But as it turns out, the anti-war movement were up and running, thank you very much, before all this hippie thing started. And in fact, it seems that some of the established anti-war people, if I can call them established, you know what I mean, were quite hostile to the hippie thing, because at the very least, it was kind of, they were aware of the fact it might discredit them somehow with the general population, or even media that might have been sympathetic towards them. And for me, that's very interesting, because in people's minds, it's like, these were the flower children rebelling against the war, but then you have this anti-war movement already up and running who are kind of like, oh, can you please not do that? We're fine, thank you.
Yeah, that was another thing that I found fascinating, and another, another one of the big misconceptions that most people have, including me, until recently, that, the first one being that the hippie movement was actually a product of San Francisco, when it was in fact a product initially of LA, that being the one main misconception. And the other one being that people almost universally these days equate the anti-war movement and the hippies, as one and the same. The hippies, to most people are the face of the anti-war movement of the 60s. And, as you were saying, that wasn't initially the case. It actually began, the anti-war movement actually began on college campuses and was being led by very, very mainstream, very clean-cut, college professors and their equally, clean-cut collegiate students. And then suddenly the hippies came along and provided a whole new face to the anti-movement, which was a face that was completely foreign to mainstream America, you know, to the heartland, so to speak. You had these people with these crazy hairstyles and clothing styles preaching about, you know, free love and open drug use and, you know, listening to this crazy music and, you know, inventing their own lingo. And, you know, and like I say, I grew up very much admiring that whole scene and wishing that I had been a part of it. But at the same time, I can see how that would be very, you know, a very offensive face to put on the anti-war movement for many Americans at that time, you know, just coming out of the very conservative 50s and suddenly you have these people just, you know, looking like they might as well be from Mars. And, you know, that, to me, that, seems very much like a deliberate strategy to put the most offensive face possible on the anti-war movement. And it was obviously very successful because, you know, as I said, to this day, people equate the hippies with the anti-war movement. But that was not the case initially. And some of the initial leaders of the anti-war movement were, as you mentioned, were none too happy when all of these, and there were suspicions then that this might have been some kind of you know, there were quotes from people saying, where are these people coming from? Is this some kind of a, you know, intelligence operation? Where are these hippies coming from? And so, yeah, there are legitimate questions to be asked about just, you know, just how effective the hippies were and again, another thing is, you know, I mean, it's very commonly believed that the hippies actually succeeded in ending the war, but the reality is that it drug on for many years beyond when the hippies emerged on the scene. And, you know, even after 4 students were gunned down at Kent State in like 1970, it still drug on for a number of years. So, to my mind, you know, I'm not seeing that the hippies really ended the war. And so, you know, yeah, it appears to me at least that the hippies really subverted what could have been a very, very effective and much more popular with you know, mainstream America, an anti-war movement that was, you know, much more effective and much more popular across a broader spectrum had the hippies not come along when they did.
Yeah, from a certain angle, it starts to look a lot like controlled opposition. And of course, we've seen a lot of that since then. We see a lot of it today. Of course, there's never been more war than there is now, as far as I can see. And all around, you see groups popping up, you know, turning protests violent and what have you.
I was going to say, it's amazing how effectively, any kind of anti-war movement, I mean, to this day, yeah, I mean, you would think that the college campuses would just be exploding across the country, you know, I mean, there's certainly no shortage of wars to oppose and no shortage of domestic policies to oppose either, you know, the massive militarization of the police and the rise of the surveillance state. And I mean, there's any number of issues that kids on campuses should be up in arms about, but you go onto a college campus these days and there's no hint of any political activism or anti-war sentiment, really. So, yeah, I mean, it seems to have had a lasting impact to this day that, I mean, there has not been a meaningful anti-war movement, you know, since the mid-'60s.
Was it the drummer in Spinal Tap who said, as long as there's the sex and drugs, I can live without the rock and roll? Besides the rock and roll, in the tale that you set out, there's a lot of sex, a lot of drugs. Now, to comment on the latter, specifically, there seems to be mountains of cocaine. And the first thing that I thought was, well, that's not really a hippie drug, is it? That's the sort of thing that, you know, you think of bankers and politicians and business people doing, you know, off the top gold-plated toilet seats or whatever, and people can do whatever they want. I'm a libertarian, you know, take whatever drugs you want whenever you want, enjoy yourself, try not to hurt anyone, you know. But it struck me that cocaine does unpleasant things to a lot of people, you know. We've got a saying in Ireland, you know, when the spirit goes in, the truth comes out. And drugs tend to amplify who you already are. And reading some of the tales in your book, it's really unpleasant. It's not some people enjoying a joint or an LSD trip. A lot of it is just mountains of coke. And from then we get on to the sexual element in all this. And to say it gets sordid and seedy would be an understatement. And you can't get through a page of your book virtually without some of this coming up. Drugs and sex are some unpleasant, frankly, combination of the two.
Yeah, the image of the pot smoking hippie that didn't really last that long, and before long at all, there was just a blizzard of cocaine blowing through Laurel Canyon, and the drugs quickly turned from the communal feel good pot thing to much harder and more dangerous and personality altering drugs. And the same thing happened in the hate. Before long you had meth and pills and much more dangerous hallucinogens like DMT and STP and just all kinds of stuff just flooding the streets. And what began as, peace and love and pass the joint, very quickly morphed into a much, much darker and more dangerous and very grim scene, to say the least.
Perhaps we should say a word about a few of the personalities. As I say, we've talked about a couple of dozen between us. There are, I don't know how many in total people you've talked about, but there's a lot. We talked about Frank Zappa earlier, and he was a very influential character. Certainly musically he has been over the years, before he passed away. But, his music lives on in a way that some of the characters from this tale, their music hasn't really. But when you read certainly the version of his life that you document, it's quite dark and disturbing. Never mind his family background. It's quite dark and disturbing compared to how people might imagine him, just as a virtuoso, super creative, boundary breaking guy.
Yeah, he was very authoritarian, very, people that worked with him tended to admire his talent, but found him all but impossible to work with. And, he would fire people from his band left and right, and just very demanding, very, very, very much of a perfectionist, very much of an authoritarian, wanted things done his way, and just spent a lot, tended to isolate himself, even from his family. He wasn't much of a family man, to say the least, and he just doesn't really fit the image of the the long-haired, free-thinking hippie so much. He definitely had a much different personality, to say the least, than what we would expect, from the leaders of the youth movement of that time. And he certainly was not alone. Arthur Lee was also regarded as quite an authoritarian figure. Stephen Stills, also, who was nicknamed the Sarge due to his military bearing and very authoritarian manner. And these were people who were very, very talented, multi-talented, Stills, Zappa, and Lee, all of them. I mean, as songwriters, musicians, vocalists. Well, Frank Zappa, not a vocalist, but producers, arrangers. They wore all the hats and did so very well. Multi-instrumentalists and they did what they did very well, but they were very, very controlling and very authoritarian in their bearing, which seemed to have been not all that uncommon. John Kay with Steppenwolf fit that pattern as well, and all these guys would routinely just fire, pretty much fire their band members at will. And, just wanted absolute control over everything. Captain Beefheart really, he took that to extremes really, and literally kept his band like imprisoned in a house and, making them work for peanuts. And it's just so, if you look you really look into the, you know, the lifestyles, not just, you know, not just the family backgrounds, which are, you know, odd enough, but the lifestyles of these people, it's just wildly out of sync with the whole peace, love, and understanding vibe that we're, you know, that we think of when we think of the 60s and the hippie counterculture.
I really enjoyed Captain Beefheart's music when I first discovered it back when I was a student, which was like in the early 90s. But
I've never really gotten it. I mean, it's something you either get or you don't, I guess. It's, yeah, I mean, to some people it's brilliant. To other people, it's just, I don't know how to describe it. You got to listen to it for yourself, I suppose. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I just think I like surreal music, and I just liked his vocal delivery and his, you know, the really fucked up lyrics. But yeah, it was really disturbing to read about. I think it was Trout Mass Replica that you talk about them being barricaded in this house with, you know, blacked out windows and everything else. So that was kind of like, okay, you know, another perception warped forever of someone you thought you knew.
Just bizarre, yeah. I mean, you know, this is an album that's, you know, regarded as a classic, regularly to this day. You know, anytime you see a list like in Rolling Stone or whatever, the 100 greatest rock albums of all time, Trout Mass Replica inevitably turns up there. And, you know, I mean, people just assume that it was recorded in a traditional way. You know, you go into a studio, but no, it was actually done in a home with, that was like a prison, basically, blacked out windows, and people were, you know, they were made to work long hours. They were deprived of sleep, deprived of food, deprived of the ability to use the bathroom at times. You know, basically held as prisoners. And according to most of them, they were never really paid for their efforts and received no credit, even though it was a collaborative effort that was put together, you know, through this group effort in the home. Beefheart took sole credit as, you know, a composer and arranger and, you know, everything else. And kept all the royalties pretty much to himself. So, I mean, he basically used his band as literally like slave labor, like imprisoned slave labor. The stories are just extraordinary. I mean, how badly these people were treated in the process of making what is, you know, today regarded as one of the greatest rock albums of all time. But there was a lot of pain involved from a lot of people in producing that album.
Well, there's a great little alleged anecdote that you include in the book, which I'm going to save for the next time I'm at a party and I'm suddenly find myself stuck for something to say. Apparently, Captain Beefheart sold a vacuum cleaner to Aldous Huxley. I did enjoy that.
That's what he claimed, yeah. During his early years as a, you know, his pre-discovery years as a traveling door-to-door salesman, he claimed to have sold a vacuum cleaner to Aldous Huxley not long before his death. Yeah. So, yeah, and Beefheart was a Zappa discovery, basically. Zappa put a lot of strange characters on the map through his, you know, his own music was not very mainstream and to this day doesn't get much radio play, but he was hugely influential among musicians, and he was a key in launching a lot of other acts, a lot of them very strange. You know, he put the GTOs together, which was just a bunch of marginally underage groupies, put them together into a band. He gave Beefheart his start. Well, actually, he knew Beefheart. They had gone to high school together in Antelope Valley, and where their fathers were both most likely military personnel, because that's the main source of employment up there is the Edwards Air Force Base and other military installations up there where they developed the stealth bomber and whatnot. And so yeah, he launched Beefheart. He launched a guy named by the name of what was his name? The crazy guy that tried to kill his mom. This guy, I mean, yeah, I mean, talk about questionable musical talent. Yeah, he put in, what was that guy's name? I can't even remember. But anyway, yeah, he he put some very strange acts out there, but some of them that he put out actually did become big stars. Alice Cooper was one of his signings, which a lot of people don't realize that the Alice Cooper band was actually a product of Laurel Canyon as well. And they started out as a psychedelic band known as Naz, and they were known mostly for putting on a very theatrical show, not necessarily being the best musicians on the scene. And Zappa signed him and refashioned him as this sort of shock rocker that that continues to inspire people like Marilyn Manson and whatnot to this day. So Zappa was responsible for putting some very unusual, bringing some very unusual acts into the mainstream, or trying to bring them into the mainstream anyway.
Another very shadowy character as part of our play is Phil Spector, the producer, best known for his Wall of Sound, so-called. And not only he was in the news, I can't remember how long ago it was, but last several years anyway, like pulling guns on people again, and I'm not sure if he's in prison. I don't know what's going on with the guy, but obviously one sandwich short of a picnic. Now, he had his team of session musicians called the Wrecking Crew, and besides his own personal life, his session musicians were significant because they played on a lot of the records. We talked earlier about some of these guys not being very good, so these are the sort of guys who actually played on a lot of these hit records.
Yeah, they were the hired guns who provided a lot of the music of the '60s. A lot of the records that you hear on the radio in daily rotation to this day on classic rock stations are not necessarily being played by the people on the album covers, because a lot of it was done in the early days, particularly by studio musicians, particularly the Wrecking Crew, who were regarded as like the best, this crack team of studio musicians who could pretty much play anything. And, they recorded for the Beach Boys, for the Byrds, for the Mommas and the Poppas, just an array of these bands, the Turtles, and just, a whole slew of artists or bands that, initially at least did not really have the musical chops to lay down these recordings in the studio. And the Wrecking Crew, and I actually have a quote which didn't make it into the book from a more contemporary drummer, and I don't remember who it was, some guy from some band from quite a few years back who said in an interview, he said, I was absolutely floored to discover that my 10 favorite drummers of all time were actually one guy who had played all of these different drum parts for all of these different bands. And they provided a lot of the particularly in the early years. They were the guys who were actually playing the music that was recorded on the albums. Phil Spector is in prison, by the way, which really kind of amazes me. It's very rare that a celebrity murder case is successfully prosecuted. We've kind of become accustomed to seeing people like O.J. and Robert Blake and whatnot walk free. And but Phil Spector was in fact convicted actually of killing that aspiring actress gal in the lobby of his home, the entrance to his home. I can't remember her name, Lana something. But he's doing time. He's I'm not sure what prison he's in, but there was a picture of him actually that surfaced recently of him in prison. And he is the rarity in Hollywood that actually got convicted and sent away.
Well, one guy who has served a lot of time is the notorious Charles Manson, and he's a central figure to all this because he kind of bridges the worlds, the various scenes that come together here, and a lot of people just know him because of being a cult leader and a convicted murderer. But he was a musician, and in fact, if things had turned out differently, he could have been one of the most significant musicians of that era, bizarrely enough.
Yeah, that's the strange thing, and not just him, but various other members of his entourage, his family were very musically oriented, and they were very much accepted as a part of the musical fraternity of Laurel Canyon. He lived for an entire summer, the summer of '68, with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, who promoted him to anyone who would listen, and introduced him to various other, members of the Buffalo Springfield, and Neil Young was very impressed with him, and there were quotes from him just praising this guy in the highest terms, and a number of people went to bat for him, trying to get him record contracts, and he had connections to the Mommas and the Poppas, and like I said, to the Beach Boys, and Buffalo Springfield, and Canned Heat, and a lot of these people knew him, and at times jammed with him and partied with him. The Beach Boys stole one of his songs and retitled it, and so he was very deeply enmeshed in that scene. It's enough so that when he came to trial, the witness list that was initially released included names like John Phillips and Mama Cass, who were initially slated to appear as witnesses in that trial, and they apparently had the connections and the power to make sure that they weren't called, and to keep that fairly low profile. And to this day, a lot of people don't know that they were supposed to be called as witnesses in that trial. So Manson was very tightly integrated into that scene, and so was Bobby Beausoleil, his lieutenant, who was doing time for the murder of Gary Hinman, a fellow musician. He was very much a part of the scene as well, and lived for a time in Laurel Canyon in an apartment not far from Jim Morrison, and even filled the rhythm guitar spot in the band Love for a while before they were signed, when they were known as the Grassroots. Before they signed on as Love, he was one of their rhythm guitarists. So Manson was very, very tightly integrated into the scene, and his fingerprints just show up all over Laurel Canyon, and the stories of these various people overlap with him in various interesting ways.
This isn't all just about music. We mentioned earlier there was political, military, all sorts of murky sort of Venn diagram style overlaps happening here. And one other group that we should mention are the Hollywood actors, or, who would later, many of them go on to be, well, they were getting established around this point, and some of them would go on to be major, major stars. And there was this group called the Young Turks, and one of the most famous films to come out of this era, which most people of a certain age will have seen, is Easy Rider. But you pick apart some of the individual stories of these either well-known or soon-to-be very well-known names, and they were partying and doing whatever else it was with a lot of these musicians and producers. And it's like one big soap opera, but the number of significant Hollywood people, even to me, knowing something about it, I was surprised at the names that were coming up. Yeah,
that's a whole nother aspect to the in addition to the to all the musicians taking up residence in the canyon, a contingent of young Hollywood actors known as the Young Turks also took up residence and regularly hung out in the canyon at that time, including Peter and Jane Fonda, and Sharon Tate, and Dennis Hopper, Bruce Dern, Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty, who else? Sal Mineo, and a few others. And they were all very tightly integrated into the scene as well. And as you mentioned, the film Easy Rider was very much a product of the Laurel Canyon scene. And the two main characters were said to be based on two of the key figures in Laurel Canyon. Dennis Hopper's character was supposed to be based on David Crosby, who regularly rode through Laurel Canyon on his motorcycle in his fringed buckskin jacket, looking very much like Hopper looked in the movie. And Peter Fonda's character was based on Roger McGowan of the Byrds. Most of the music was provided by Laurel Canyon musicians, Steppenwolf and the Byrds and Fraternity of Man, and I don't remember what else is on there, but most of the music on there is from Laurel Canyon bands, and some of the filming was even done in Laurel Canyon. So there was a very, very, very close relationship between young Hollywood and these emerging musicians. And that's not the only movie. There were several other movies, countercultural movies of the 60s that were basically products of Laurel Canyon. Head, the movie about the Monkees movie, which was co-written by Jack Nicholson of all people. A lot of people don't realize that he was a fairly successful screenwriter before he made his name as an actor. He also wrote The Trip, which was Hollywood's version of an LSD trip, and which starred Peter Fonda and Bruce Dern. And so all of these people were and was filmed at a home in Laurel Canyon that the band Love lived in at one time. So there was very, very close relationship between these the young actors and the young musicians, all of whom would become these huge, larger than life stars, the ones that lived anyway. And again, what you find if you go through the family background of all of the quote unquote young Turks, you again find that the vast majority of them are products of the military and intelligence complex. So you have that, so you have to add that to this whole mix of coincidences that you also had this gathering of young Hollywood talent there that also just happened to come from this same curious background, and that were also hugely influential, in shaping the youth counterculture through these movies like Easy Rider and The Trip and whatnot.
Another interesting film produced around this time was Performance, which was co-directed by Donald Cammell, another figure with a sort of dark side to his life and a tragic end. And the film stars Mick Jagger, the Rolling Stones, and Edward Fox. And this came to my attention because Cammell, after he eventually got another film made, it was called Demon Seed in 1977, and being a sci-fi buff, that caught my attention, but I was drawn back to Performance. And in many ways, to me, that's almost like more typical of the atmosphere, the period that we're talking about, dark, dangerous, worlds and underworlds mixing with each other, all sorts of like cloak and dagger stuff going on. And of course, the Rolling Stones have got a role in this as well. We think of the events of Hyde Park and Altamont that came in many people's minds to signal, the end of the summer of love or whatever, and their involvement with the Hells Angels. But as I say, for me, that was like, well, this is almost more capturing the mood than any kind of overly optimistic, documentary might have at the time. I'm thinking of some of the festival footage at the time where you see people rolling around in the mud and flinging flowers in the air, and everybody looks to be having a royally great time. And the underbelly of all this is much more important. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah, I mean, there was a very, very, very dark underbelly, which somewhat came to the surface at Altamont, where I think like 4 people died or something. The one that's remembered, of course, is Meredith Hunter, who was stabbed to death right in front of the stage by members of the Hells Angels, who had been hired curiously enough, as a security detail. It's weird that, the Hells Angels are often thought of as part of the whole, youth hippie counterculture of the 1960s. But they couldn't have been more diametrically opposed to the hippies, actually. The Hells Angels were very right-wing, authoritarian, type groups, and that were very much at odds with the hippies and the anti-war movement, and yet they were, brought in to serve as a security detail, and then everyone was shocked when things went bad, but even Woodstock, I mean, there's a dark side to that. I mean, the image that most people have is of this great love fest of, 3 days of music and just everybody doing their own thing and just this great, wonderful social experiment. But from people that I've talked to, the reality was quite different. The place was way overbooked. It had way more people there than could be reasonably accommodated. They did not have facilities to serve all of these people. There were serious, bathroom shortages, which resulted in, overflowing toilets and raw sewage flowing out. And, these people were basically trapped. A lot of them had to abandon their cars and couldn't get out of there even if they wanted to. And they get there and they're deprived of sleep and, for days on end, and they're wallowing in the mud, and, there's food shortages, there's sanitation issues, and, there's LSD being freely distributed whether you want it or not, and I don't imagine that it was necessarily an overwhelmingly positive experience for everyone that attended there, but certainly not as dark as the Rolling Stones fiasco at Altamont.
Well, the picture you paint sounds more like World War I, on acid.
Yeah, the Altamont one was not good in any way. I mean, right from the beginning, it just had a very, very dark vibe to it, and ultimately resulted in a very high profile death on film of Meredith Hunter, which can still be seen to this day in the Rolling Stones documentary film "Gimme Shelter," which is arguably the most widely circulated snuff film of all time, I would say, where you have an actual on-screen murder that's, been in the movie for however many years now.
Chapter 3 of your book is essentially a laundry list of deaths, many of them with, under suspicious circumstances or some other sort of lack of a satisfactory explanation. But there were some high-profile deaths that took place that weren't in and around Laurel Canyon. I mean, for example, John Lennon we'd have to mention in this context here, especially when we start to think about military-industrial involvement and what have you, and, dark, black ops, etc., and the psyop element in some of this on the general public. And of course, you had Jim Morrison dying in Paris, Hendrix, Keith Moon, Cass Elliot dying in the UK, but these are all related, all linked back in the sort of family tree of of death.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's amazing, and that's another, a place where there's just a huge disconnect between, the peace, love, and understanding vibe and flowers in the hair that we're supposed to associate with that scene, and the real backdrop, which was just incredibly bloody and violent. And so many people came to curious ends, either people actually in Laurel Canyon, where like the Wonderland quadruple murder was committed, or to people very closely connected to Laurel Canyon, which includes the Manson murders and all of the deaths you mentioned, and Graham Parsons, and just a whole slew of people. Wives and girlfriends were vulnerable. Jackson Browne's wife came to an untimely end at a very early age, as did David Crosby's girlfriend, I believe it was, Graham Nash's girlfriend, and some of these. And then there was, the murders that were actually committed in Laurel Canyon, like silent film star Ramon Navarro, Sal Mineo, killed right at the base of Laurel Canyon, Inger Stevens, a starlet from bygone era who was found dead in her home, and a couple bodies that were just dumped there in Laurel Canyon, and just an incredible amount of blood flowing out of a canyon that was supposed to epitomize, peace, love, and understanding.
Have you done an actual head count in terms? I mean, obviously, their deaths were happening overlapping with the beginning of the period you talk about and afterwards, but just in the the scene set out in your book, did you actually do at any point get an impression of how many deaths you documented? You know, was it?
I would say maybe I don't know, probably 100. I know there's a lot. I know there's just a staggering number of people who, and as I mentioned, including the two most famed mass murders in the history of the city. There are 5 victims at the Tate Polanski residence, and the 4 victims in the Wonderland home, all directly connected to the scene. And as Michael Walker pointed out, those kind of provided the bookends to that era, the Manson murders in 69 and then the Wonderland murders in, I think it was 80. And but in between there was just an amazing array of other murders, or oftentimes what appeared to be murders. Sometimes they were listed as murders, sometimes not, but deaths under very suspicious and violent circumstances were just way too frequent, in connection to that scene.
Yeah, I mean, as we draw things to a close for today, Dave, I'll just throw in that in the epilogue to your book, you tie in all of this with your previous book that you'd written called Program to Kill, and you just making observations about everything that you'd written in this book and the overlap with California and the significance of serial killers in that area around that time, just what a concentration it was. You know, if you put up a map of the USA and start sticking pins in it and just seeing where they clustered, it was like very odd.
Yeah, to say the least. Yeah. And, the epilogue is, primarily about, Rodney Alcala, the so-called dating game killer who also had very curious, connections to that, scene. You know, his first alleged victim was a very young girl who was the daughter of a record company executive who was living at the Chateau Marmont Hotel alongside various rock stars. And then one of his later victims was dumped at the north mouth of Laurel Canyon, very near the Marlon Brando and Jack Nicholson estates. And in between there, he bumped into numerous people connected to Laurel Canyon. He went to UCLA Film School at the same time as Jim Morrison and Ray Manzarek. He took a film class in New York, taught by Roman Polanski. One of his crimes was investigated by this police detective who just happened to be the son of a prime suspect in the Black Dahlia murders, who was very closely connected to the Mommas and the Poppas. And he just had this very strange web of connections between him and various people and places in that scene. So in addition to Charles Manson, prowling around, you had a second guy who would later be regarded as a very prolific serial killer, who was also plying that his trade at that time. And what I discovered is that's kind of a common theme. The Laurel Canyon scene kind of came on the heels of the folk rock scene, which was largely centered in Cambridge, which also had its own resident serial killer operating at that very time in the form of Albert DeSalvo, aka the Boston Strangler. And if you fast forward to like the Seattle scene, you find that concurrent with that, you had this guy who would be known as the Green River Killer. So serial killers and rock scenes seem to go together for some reason. Very curious.
And you mentioned the Chateau Marmont hotel there, which, from my reading, scene of a lot of Led Zeppelin's debauchery, and it reminded me we've not even had time to talk about the occult and bizarre rituals and all of this. If people want to read about that, they're just going to have to get your book.
I guess so. Yeah, the Chateau Marmont is notorious. It has been for many, many years as the scene of various scenes of debauchery and the death site of John Belushi, where he, died after being supposedly administered a speedball by this Kathy Smith, who of course was a part of the Laurel Canyon scene and a part of Gene Clark of the Byrds entourage for a while. And the chateau is right at the mouth of Laurel Canyon and was frequently home to bands that were in LA while they were touring. It was a very, very popular destination in the scene of all kinds of sordid goings on, to say the least. Very, very notorious place. Very, very expensive, very high-end place, but known for being the scene of a lot of depraved rock star debauchery, to say the least.
Well, if I was to describe your book in 4 words, I think it would be never a dull moment. But that's that's available widely this side of the pond. Everyone can get it online, not a problem. But tell folks if you've got a website you want to share, or anything you're working on, have done, just anything you want to put out there.
Yeah, people have told me that it's a very addictive read, and it's hard to put down once you pick it up, which is hugely flattering. It's very, very gratifying to hear stuff like that, because I put a lot of time and work into it. But anyway, my website is at www.davesweb.cnchost.com, which is kind of a mouthful. It's probably easier to find if you just Google my name, either Dave McGowan or David McGowan. It should come up at the top of the list. It's the website is officially known as the Center for an Informed America, and that is where all of my unpublished work is. Basically, it's where Laurel Canyon started. Most of my books began as a series of web posts and then sort of transformed into books, Laurel Canyon being the latest. But there are all kinds of other book-length series of web posts on there on 911 and I don't know, just all kinds of stuff. Lots and lots of freely available information there. It's a 100% free site, and I am offering my latest book for sale. You'll see the links on the page to an order page. There's both a domestic and an international order page for anyone who is interested in ordering a signed copy of my book, which is available for a very good price here in America. Unfortunately, it's quite a bit higher for your readers there in the UK due to the very high cost of international shipping. I think it cost me like $15 or something like that to ship a book over there, so it almost doubles the price of the book. But if somebody really, really wants a signed copy, that's where they can get them, and if not, then just enjoy all the other stuff that's there available. And I guess that's about all I got.
Cool, excellent. Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I greatly enjoyed it, and hope to talk to you again.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is LegalizeFreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.